The packed House review panel hearing room fell completely silent as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett calmly adjusted her microphone. What had started as a routine government ethics hearing had suddenly transformed when Crockett placed a thick folder labeled Johnson Family Financial Records on the table before her. Speaker Mike Johnson, who had agreed to testify about congressional ethics reforms, visibly tensed as Crockett opened the folder and removed several highlighted documents. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett began, her voice measured but clear, "I appreciate your testimony today about openness and ethical leadership. Before we discuss your suggested reforms, I'd like to address some inconsistencies I've discovered in your family's financial records, specifically regarding an LLC registered to your wife that appears to have received significant payments from entities with business before this Congress." Johnson's expression shifted from composed to concerned in an instant. The panel chairman, recognizing the unexpected turn, leaned forward. "Congresswoman, this hearing is about suggested ethics reforms, not, with all due respect, Mr. Chairman," Crockett interjected firmly, "examining current compliance with ethics requirements is directly relevant to discussing reforms. I have specific questions about undisclosed financial relationships that the American people deserve answers." As camera flashes illuminated the room, Johnson loosened his tie slightly. "Congresswoman, my family's finances have been properly disclosed according to House rules." "If you have specific, I do have specifics, Mr. Speaker," Crockett answered, holding up the first document. "This is a filing for Bayou Bridge Consulting LLC registered in Benton, Louisiana, 3 years ago with your wife listed as the sole managing member. According to financial records I've obtained, this LLC has received over $740,000 in payments from 3 organizations that have lobbied for legislation you've supported. Yet this entity doesn't appear on any of your financial disclosure forms." The room erupted in murmurs. Johnson reached for his water glass, his hand visibly unsteady. The panel chairman banged his gavel, struggling to restore order as journalists frantically typed on their phones. Johnson whispered something to his counsel sitting beside him. What happened next stunned everyone present. As Crockett prepared to continue with her inquiry, showing a second document to the clerk for distribution, Speaker Johnson abruptly stood up. "Mr. Chairman, I need to consult with my counsel on these unexpected allegations. I request a recess." Without waiting for the chairman's response, Johnson quickly gathered his papers and, flanked by his staff, walked rapidly toward the exit door. Panel members from both parties watched in disbelief as the Speaker of the House, third in line for the presidency, effectively fled the hearing room rather than face Crockett's inquiry about his wife's undisclosed business dealings. The image of Johnson's hasty exit would soon become one of the most shocking moments in recent congressional history. A powerful symbol of accountability that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in Washington overnight. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable confrontation and its far-reaching aftermath, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more exclusive coverage of the political moments that mainstream media often misses or downplays. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our breaking analysis of Washington's most consequential power struggles. Speaker Mike Johnson wasn't simply any congressional leader facing ethics questions. His rise to power had been meteoric and unexpected, ascending to the speakership after a chaotic leadership struggle when more senior Republicans couldn't secure enough votes. A former attorney from Louisiana with strong conservative credentials, Johnson had built his political brand around traditional values, fiscal responsibility, and what he frequently called openness and accountability in government. Throughout his tenure as Speaker, Johnson had positioned himself as a reformer, regularly appearing on news programs to criticize what he called the Washington swamp and promise a return to ethical leadership. His signature legislative initiative, the Accountable America Act, included expanded financial disclosure requirements for federal officials, a fact that made questions about his own records particularly problematic. Behind Johnson's public image as a reformer, however, were growing whispers in Washington circles about potential ethical conflicts. Several watchdog organizations had filed Freedom of Information Act requests regarding his family's business interests, and anonymous sources had begun providing tips to journalists about consulting work by Johnson's wife that allegedly wasn't appearing on official records. Despite these background issues, Johnson had maintained relatively strong support within the Republican conference, with many members viewing him as a stable leader who could unify the parties' fractious wings while presenting a respectable public face for their agenda. His approval ratings among conservative voters remained solid, bolstered by regular appearances on friendly media outlets where he advocated for traditional values and fiscal conservatism. Across the political divide stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing Texas's 30th congressional district. Though only in her second term, Crockett had quickly established herself as one of the most formidable members of the review panel. Her background as a civil rights attorney before entering politics had given her both courtroom experience and a deep understanding of how to build systematic evidence-based cases. Unlike many politicians who used review hearings primarily for performative speeches designed for social media clips, Crockett had developed a reputation for careful preparation and devastating inquiry based on extensive document research. Her legal background was evident in her method: thorough investigation, careful organization of evidence, and precise inquiry that built toward inescapable conclusions. "He approaches congressional hearings like a prosecutor building a case," noted one political analyst, while other members are writing tweets. "She's reviewing financial records and cross-referencing public records." This method had already produced several viral moments where Crockett had exposed contradictions in testimony from various officials, but she had generally focused on policy implementation rather than personal ethics, making her sudden focus on the speaker's family finances all the more surprising. The stakes of this particular hearing extended far beyond typical political skirmishes. With midterm elections approaching and control of the House potentially hanging in the balance, both parties were sensitive to ethics issues that could shift public perception. Johnson's Accountable America Act had been positioned as a cornerstone of Republicans' election messaging, evidence that they were serious about cleaning up Washington, despite criticism from Democrats that the bill contained significant loopholes. For Johnson personally, the hearing represented a chance to showcase his commitment to ethical leadership while highlighting his signature legislation. As polling showed voters increasingly concerned about corruption in politics, Johnson needed to reinforce his image as a reformer who would hold both parties accountable to higher standards. For Crockett and the Democrats, the hearing offered a chance to test whether Republicans' rhetoric about openness would extend to their own leadership. With Johnson advocating for stronger disclosure requirements for others, any gaps in his own compliance would create a powerful narrative about hypocrisy that could resonate with voters beyond political divisions. The hearing room was filled beyond capacity with staff members standing against the walls and a line of people still waiting outside hoping for seats. C-SPAN cameras captured the proceedings live, while congressional reporters from major publications sat in the front row, laptops open. Representatives from various ethics watchdog groups observed from the gallery, each with their own interest in how disclosure requirements might be strengthened or weakened in upcoming legislation. As Speaker Johnson had concluded his opening statement detailing his commitment to a new era of openness in Washington, the stage was set for panel members' questions. Several Republicans had already asked friendly questions that allowed Johnson to elaborate on his reform proposals, while Democrats had pressed him on whether the legislation contained sufficient enforcement mechanisms. Then came Crockett's turn for inquiry. As the panel chair recognized her for her 5-minute period, few anticipated the major shift that was about to occur. Most expected standard Democratic critiques about loopholes in the Republican proposal or questions about implementation timelines. What they witnessed instead was a carefully orchestrated revelation that would rock Washington and fundamentally alter the trajectory of Johnson's speakership. All triggered by a Louisiana LLC that supposedly no one was ever meant to discover. Mr. Speaker Crockett went on after Johnson's attempt to leave was blocked by the chairman's ruling that no recess would be granted during active inquiry. These financial records indicate that Bayou Bridge Consulting LLC received 3 payments totaling $275,000 from Gulf States Energy Partners between January and June of last year. During this same period, you sponsored H.R. 4726, which included specific regulatory exemptions that would directly benefit this company's operations. Can you explain why this financial relationship wasn't disclosed? Johnson, visibly uncomfortable, returned to his seat. Congresswoman, I'm not familiar with the specific transactions you're referencing. My wife's career work is separate from my legislative responsibilities, and we've always followed disclosure requirements as we understand them. Let me be more specific then, Crockett answered, holding up another document. This is a copy of the check dated March 15th for $125,000 from Gulf States Energy Partners to Bayou Bridge Consulting. 3 weeks later, you added an amendment to H.R. 4726 that exempted regional distribution networks in states with less than 5 million residents from certain environmental review requirements, a provision that directly benefited Gulf States' suggested pipeline project. The room fell completely silent as Crockett placed the document in front of her. Johnson's counsel whispered urgently in his ear, but the speaker's face had already flushed red. "I'm not involved in my wife's consulting clients," Johnson insisted, his voice slightly unsteady. "And any legislative positions I've taken are based on policy considerations, not Mr. Speaker," Crockett interrupted, her tone remaining professional but insistent. House Ethics Rule 26.5 explicitly requires disclosure of any spouse's income that could present potential ethical conflicts with official duties. The rule doesn't require your direct involvement in your wife's business to trigger disclosure requirements. Johnson reached for his water again. Several Republican panel members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while Democrats watched intently as Crockett went on her systematic presentation. Perhaps even more concerning, she went on, financial records show that Bayou Bridge Consulting received $180,000 from Heartland Health Solutions last October. The following month, you personally intervened with HHS Secretary Beckham to expedite approval of Heartland's medication management application according to these emails between your office and Secretary Beckham. She held up printed copies of mail correspondence, then passed them to the clerk for distribution. Mr. Speaker, can you explain why you didn't recuse yourself from matters involving a company that was paying your family significant sums through this LLC? The panel room had grown increasingly tense. Several Republican members were now passing notes to each other, while the chairman appeared uncertain about how to proceed. Johnson conferred with his counsel again, this time for nearly a minute. As the room waited in uncomfortable silence when he finally answered, Johnson's tone had changed from confident to defensive. "Congresswoman, these are complex matters involving my wife's independent career work. If there have been any oversights in disclosure, they were certainly unintentional and will be promptly addressed. I would need to review these specific documents before commenting further." Crockett nodded slightly. "I understand the need to review documents, Mr. Speaker. However, I'm concerned about a pattern that suggests these weren't isolated oversights. This third document shows Bayou Bridge Consulting received $285,000 from Clearwater Development Group last year, a company that received a $47 million contract through the infrastructure bill after you personally advocated for the project's inclusion. Again, none of these payments appear on your financial records." At this point, several journalists had left their seats to file breaking stories. The panel chairman, looking increasingly uncomfortable, checked the time. "The gentleman has 1 minute remaining." "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Crockett acknowledged. "Mr. Speaker, my final question is straightforward. Do you believe officials should be held accountable when they fail to disclose financial relationships that could influence their official actions?" The question, echoing Johnson's own frequent statements about accountability, created a no-win situation. Agreeing would implicitly acknowledge his own failure, while disagreeing would contradict his public position on ethics. Johnson paused, then answered carefully. "Openness is essential in government. If records need to be amended, I commit to doing so immediately after reviewing these allegations." To clarify, Crockett pressed, "These aren't allegations. They're documented financial transactions and official actions that appear to violate House ethics rules. My question is whether you believe there should be consequences for such violations, as you've advocated for others." Before Johnson could respond, his counsel wrote something on a notepad and showed it to him urgently. Johnson read it, then addressed the chairman rather than answering Crockett's question. "Mr. Chairman, given the serious nature of these unexpected questions, I respectfully request a brief recess to consult with counsel and review these documents before continuing." The chairman, perhaps relieved to pause the increasingly damaging exchange, nodded quickly. "The panel will recess for 30 minutes to allow the speaker to review the documents." As the gavel came down, Johnson immediately stood and walked rapidly toward the side exit surrounded by staff. Rather than simply stepping outside the hearing room, however, He went on down the hallway and out of the building entirely, with journalists following and shouting questions that went unanswered. Inside the hearing room, panel members remained seated, many looking stunned by what had transpired. Crockett quietly organized her documents, her composed expression revealing nothing about whether she had anticipated Johnson's dramatic exit. The chairman, after conferring with panel staff, returned to the microphone. "I've just been informed that the speaker has left the Capitol complex entirely. This hearing will remain in recess until further notice." As members began gathering their materials, the enormity of what had just occurred began to sink in. The Speaker of the House, the third highest official in the U.S. government, had effectively fled rather than continue answering questions about his family's undisclosed financial dealings. Whatever happened next, Washington had just witnessed a moment that would reverberate through the political landscape for months to come. By the time panel members exited the hearing room, the scene outside had transformed into chaos. Journalists crowded the hallway, broadcasting live updates as news of Johnson's abrupt departure spread throughout Washington. Camera crews positioned themselves at the Capitol exits, hoping to capture the speaker if he returned, while producers frantically booked ethics experts to explain the significance of the financial relationships Crockett had exposed. "What we witnessed today was remarkable," one network legal analyst explained on air. Congresswoman Crockett presented documented evidence of significant payments to an LLC controlled by the speaker's wife from companies directly affected by his official actions. Payments that were never disclosed as required by House ethics rules. The speaker's decision to leave rather than address these questions speaks volumes. Inside the Capitol, Republican leadership was in emergency discussions. Senior members huddled in the majority leader office trying to formulate a response strategy while frantically calling Johnson, whose phone apparently went straight to voicemail. Democrats, meanwhile, gathered in their conference room where Crockett was briefing leadership on the documents she had compiled and the additional evidence she had not yet presented publicly. "This isn't about political advantage," Crockett told her colleagues, according to someone present at the meeting. "This is about whether we have one set of rules for everyone, or different standards depending on position and party. The evidence speaks for itself." As the afternoon progressed, without any statement from the Speaker's office, journalists began piecing together a more complete picture of Bayou Bridge Consulting LLC. Business records showed it had been registered 3 years earlier with minimal public footprint. No website, no physical office, and no employees besides Johnson's wife. Banking. Records obtained by investigators suggested the company had received over $200,000 in total payments from various entities with business before Congress, none of which had been included in Johnson's financial records. At 4:30 p.m., nearly 4 hours after Johnson's departure, his office finally issued a brief statement. "Speaker Johnson takes ethics obligations seriously. Today's hearing raised questions about disclosure requirements that will be thoroughly reviewed. The Speaker will address these matters directly, after consulting with the House Ethics panel about proper amendments to his financial records." The statement's careful wording acknowledging the need for amendments without admitting wrongdoing did little to quell the growing storm. Ethics experts from across the political spectrum appeared on news programs throughout the evening, most concluding that the transactions Crockett had highlighted clearly should have been disclosed under House rules. "The rules aren't ambiguous on this point," explained a former House Ethics Panel counsel on a primetime news program. "Income received by a spouse from entities with business before Congress must be disclosed specifically because of the potential conflicts of interest. The fact that these payments were routed through an LLC doesn't change the disclosure requirement." By evening, the political fallout was spreading beyond ethics questions to broader issues about Johnson's leadership. Several moderate Republicans in competitive districts issued statements expressing concern about the allegations and calling for full openness. Conservative media outlets initially attempted to dismiss the issue as a Democratic attack. But as more details emerged about the specific transactions and their connection to Johnson's legislative actions, their defense became increasingly muted. The following morning, the Washington Post published a detailed investigation that had apparently been underway for months, revealing additional payments to Bayou Bridge Consulting from companies that had benefited from Johnson's official actions. The article included emails obtained through FOIA requests that showed Johnson's office coordinating directly with agencies on matters affecting these same companies. Further undermining his claim of separation, between his wife's business and his official responsibilities. As pressure mounted, Johnson remained out of public view, his office canceling his scheduled appearances and declining to provide information about his whereabouts. This absence created a leadership vacuum that escalated issues within the Republican conference, with several members privately discussing contingency plans should Johnson's position become untenable. At noon, Congresswoman Crockett held a media briefing that further altered the trajectory of the unfolding drama. Rather than attacking Johnson personally or calling for his resignation, as many expected, she focused entirely on the institutional issues at stake. "This isn't about Speaker Johnson as an individual," she stated, her tone measured and serious. "This is about whether our ethics rules are meaningfully enforced regardless of position or party. The evidence I presented yesterday raises serious questions about undisclosed financial relationships that appear to have influenced official actions. The American people deserve a complete accounting of these relationships and appropriate accountability under House rules." This method, focusing on institutional integrity rather than political advantage, made it difficult for Republicans to dismiss the issue as politically motivated. Several ethics organizations from across the political spectrum issued statements supporting Crockett's position that the transaction should have been disclosed regardless of intent. By mid-afternoon, with Johnson still absent and Republicans struggling to present a unified defense, the House Ethics Panel announced it would conduct an expedited review of the matter. This announcement, which came with bipartisan support from panel members, elevated the issue from media controversy to formal investigation, a significant escalation that further undermined Johnson's position. As evening approached with still no public appearance by the Speaker, Republican leadership faced a critical decision. Several senior members met privately to discuss whether to publicly defend Johnson, distance themselves from him, or begin considering succession plans. The resulting statement issued jointly by the Majority Leader and Whip was notably lukewarm. "We take ethics matters seriously and support a thorough and expeditious review. We expect Speaker Johnson to provide a complete explanation to members and the public promptly." The carefully worded statement, which neither defended Johnson nor called for his resignation, reflected the rapidly deteriorating political reality. What had begun as a seemingly routine review hearing had, through Crockett's systematic presentation of evidence, evolved into a full-blown leadership crisis that threatened not just Johnson's speakership, but potentially Republican control of the House itself. As Washington prepared for what promised to be a remarkable next day, the contrast between Crockett's composed, evidence-based method and Johnson's hasty retreat had already reshaped the narrative. The triumph wasn't that a Democrat had embarrassed a Republican leader. It was that carefully documented facts had prevailed over position and power, reminding everyone in Washington that accountability could still reach even those at the highest levels of government. The days following Crockett's revelation and Johnson's abrupt departure brought major shifts in Washington's political landscape. After 36 hours of absence from public view, Johnson finally appeared at a hastily arranged media briefing in the Capitol, flanked by his wife and legal counsel rather than Republican leadership, a telling indication of his increasingly isolated position. "I want to address the questions raised about financial records relating to my wife's consulting business," Johnson began, his typically confident demeanor notably subdued. "After reviewing the House ethics guidelines with counsel, I acknowledge that certain financial relationships should have been disclosed, more specifically on my forms. These oversights were unintentional, and I have directed my team to file amended records immediately." Johnson went on to announce that his wife would dissolve Bayou Bridge Consulting LLC and cease all consulting work to avoid even the appearance of ethical conflicts. However, his explanation that the disclosure failures were mere review rather than intentional concealment satisfied few observers, particularly given the significant amounts involved and their direct connection to his legislative actions. The media briefing took a more damaging turn during questions when a reporter asked directly, "Mr. Speaker, why did you leave the hearing rather than answer Congresswoman Crockett's questions about these payments?" Johnson's hesitation before responding spoke volumes, and his eventual answer that he needed to consult with counsel before addressing complex matters contradicted his frequent public statements about openness and accountability. Behind closed doors, Republican members were meeting in increasingly urgent sessions to assess their options. While publicly, Most expressed support for Johnson's explanation about unintentional oversights. Privately, many expressed concern about the political damage already inflicted and likely to come. As one Republican congressman told his staff, "When the speaker literally runs away from inquiry, that image doesn't disappear with an apology." For Crockett, the aftermath brought increased national prominence but also a strategic challenge: how to ensure the focus remained on the institutional issues rather than political advantage. She maintained the same measured method that had made her initial inquiry so effective, declining numerous invitations for television appearances and instead issuing a single statement. The speaker's acknowledgement that he failed to disclose significant financial relationships affecting his official actions is a first step toward accountability. However, the American people deserve a complete accounting of all such relationships and appropriate consequences under House rules. This isn't about politics. It's about maintaining the integrity of an institution that belongs to all Americans. This method, substantive rather than triumphalist, further distinguished Crockett's handling of the issue from typical Washington scandals. By focusing consistently on the ethical principles at stake rather than political points scored, she made it difficult for Johnson's allies to dismiss the matter as political theater. The House Ethics Panel, responding to the unusual public interest in their normally secretive proceedings, took the rare step of issuing a progress update on their investigation. Their statement confirmed they were reviewing significant evidence regarding undisclosed financial relationships and expected to complete their investigation within 30 days, an accelerated timeline that created additional pressure on Johnson and Republican leadership. 2 weeks after the initial hearing, the political consequences began materializing in concrete ways. 3 moderate Republicans in competitive districts publicly called for Johnson to step aside as Speaker until the ethics investigation was complete, citing issues about how the scandal would affect their re-election prospects. Conservative members, while not directly challenging Johnson, began discussing the need for new conference rules about financial records, a thinly veiled critique of the current leadership. The broader implications extended beyond Johnson's personal future to affect the legislative agenda and political dynamics in Washington. The Accountable America Act, which Johnson had positioned as Republican signature ethics reform, was quietly removed from the legislative calendar, its credibility fatally undermined by its sponsors' own compliance failures. Several corporate donors paused their contributions to Republican committees, citing issues about association with ethics disputes during an election year. For congressional review more generally, Crockett's method established a new standard that members from both parties began emulating. Panel staff reported receiving numerous requests for training on financial disclosure research and document analysis as members recognized the power of methodically presented evidence over theatrical confrontation. Several review hearings in subsequent weeks featured notably more substantive document-based inquiry from members of both parties, a development that ethics watchdogs celebrated as a positive development for accountability, regardless of political outcomes. 1 month after the initial hearing, the House Ethics Panel released its report on Johnson's records, confirming most of the financial relationships Crockett had identified and concluding that Johnson had failed to disclose significant financial interests that could influence his official actions. In violation of House rules, the panel recommended a formal reprimand, a significant sanction for a sitting speaker, and required Johnson to file amended records for his entire congressional tenure. The report created an untenable position for Johnson, Republican leadership recognizing that maintaining him as Speaker would become a political liability. Affecting every member's re-election, prospects began privately suggesting he step aside, for the good of the conference. After several days of resistance, Johnson finally announced he would resign the speakership while remaining in Congress, triggering another leadership election and period of uncertainty for the Republican majority. In his resignation statement, Johnson acknowledged that the dispute surrounding my family's financial records has become a distraction from the important work before Congress. While he maintained that the disclosure failures were unintentional, the political reality had become inescapable, and his position was no longer tenable in the face of the documented financial relationships Crockett had exposed. For Crockett personally, the aftermath brought both opportunities and challenges. Her national profile had risen dramatically, with political analysts from both parties acknowledging the effectiveness of her systematic evidence-based method. Democratic leadership increasingly sought her input on review strategy, recognizing that her legal background brought valuable perspective to the often theatrical world of congressional hearings. At the same time, Crockett worked to ensure that her sudden prominence didn't overshadow her broader legislative agenda or the institutional principles at stake. When asked during a rare television interview whether she felt vindicated by Johnson's resignation, she directed the conversation, "This isn't about personal victories or political advantage. It's about whether we have meaningful ethics rules that apply equally to everyone in government, regardless of position or party. If this situation leads to stronger disclosure requirements and better compliance, that's the real victory for the American people." This focus on institutional integrity, rather than personal or political advantage, represented perhaps the most significant aspect of Crockett's handling of the entire situation. In an era when political confrontations typically generated more heat than light, her method had demonstrated that carefully researched, factually grounded review could create meaningful accountability, even at the highest levels of government. 6 months later, as Washington adjusted to new House leadership and the policy implications of the scandal faded, the lasting legacy of Crockett's revelation emerged in more subtle but potentially more significant ways. The House adopted new, stricter disclosure requirements for family businesses with bipartisan support, a direct response to the specific issues raised in Johnson's case. Panel staff reported that members from both parties were requesting more document-based preparation for hearings, rather than focusing primarily on viral moments or political talking points. Perhaps most tellingly, a political consulting firm's internal analysis of effective congressional inquiry, later leaked to the press, advised clients the Crockett method. Research-driven document-based inquiry focused on specific factual contradictions is demonstrably more effective than performative outrage or political attacks. Preparation matters more than performance. For ordinary citizens watching this drama unfold, the lasting lesson was about the continuing power of facts and evidence in an era often defined by political narratives and alternative realities. Crockett's method, thorough research, precise presentation, and focus on institutional principles rather than personal attacks, had proven that accountability was still possible in American democracy, when pursued with systematic determination and a commitment to evidence over ideology. As one political commentator noted in a widely shared analysis, what brought down a speaker wasn't a political attack or a media expose. It was a Congresswoman with a folder full of documents and the preparation to use them effectively. In a political era often dominated by performance over substance, Jasmine Crockett reminded Washington that the most powerful review tool remains the systematic presentation of inconvenient facts. This remarkable episode, from Crockett's initial revelation to Johnson's eventual resignation, demonstrated that in a functioning democracy, no position, not even the third highest office in the government, places someone beyond accountability when faced with carefully documented evidence of ethical violations. That principle, rather than any political outcome, represented the true significance of one of the most consequential congressional hearings in recent American history. If you found this analysis valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of the moments in Congress that actually shape our democracy. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think more members of Congress should adopt Crockett's evidence-based method to review? We'll be back soon with more content that goes beyond the political noise to examine how our democratic institutions actually function when put to the